starting at age 40, you're losing 1% of your muscle every year. It's replaced by fat if your weight stays the same. So if you brag about keeping your weight the same for 10 years after 40, it means that 10% of your muscle has been replaced by fat.
Stephen Quay, MD, PhD, is the founder of Seattle-based Atossa Therapeutics, a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company focused on cancer and infectious diseases with an initial focus on breast cancer and COVID-19. His TED Talk on breast cancer prevention, How to Be Smart When You're Dense, has been viewed over 229,000 times. He received an MD, MA, and PhD from the University of Michigan, was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT working with a Nobel laureate. He has over 390 published contributions to medicine and has been cited 11,600 times. He holds 90 U.S. patents, 22 in the fields of medicine. He has invented 7 FDA-approved pharmaceuticals and has even tested before Congress twice.
We are not the toughest animal on the planet. We are not the fastest animal on the planet, but we need to be the smartest animal on the planet. So we've talked about cardiovascular, heart and lung, resistance training, lifting weights, and you have to do the whole body. So, for example,
Hi, my name is Chris Burris. I'm a longevity expert and the chief scientist at a lab focused on a longevity molecule. My primary focus is to help people live longer and better lives with science. Make sure to subscribe and share so you and your friends can live longer and better. Well, actually, so you and your friends can live beyond the norms.
There are 2 diseases that top the list of the scariest diseases. The first is actually Alzheimer's disease. And the second, the topic of today's talk, is cancer. It is clearly one of those diseases of aging and one of the brick walls between us and extremely long lives. On cancer.org, it states that 41% of men will develop cancer, with 1 in 5 dying from cancer. In women, the numbers are very similar, with 39% developing cancer and 1 in 6 at risk from dying from cancer. Our next speaker is here to help us understand this scary disease and to leave us with a better understanding of the disease and maybe a little less fear about the disease. Stephen Quay, MD, PhD, is the founder of Seattle-based Atossa Therapeutics, on the NASDAQ, that's ATOS, a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company focused on cancer and infectious diseases with an initial focus on breast cancer and COVID-19. His TED Talk on breast cancer prevention, How to Be Smart When You're Dense, has been viewed over 229,000 times. By the way, I love the title, How to Be Smart When You're Dense, referring to the mammogram result. He received an MD, MA, and PhD from the University of Michigan, was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT working with a Nobel laureate. He has over 390 published contributions to medicine and has been cited 11,600 times. He holds 90 U.S. patents, 22 in the fields of medicine. He has invented 7 FDA-approved pharmaceuticals and has even tested before Congress twice. Dr. Quay and I have 2 things in common, none of them related to the accolades that I just mentioned. First, he currently resides close to Taipei, Taiwan. I learned it's a nuance in terms of distance. I used to live in Taipei when I was younger. Second, he is on the board of the Taipei American School, which is a school I attended when I lived in Taiwan. I loved how small this world really is, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Dr. Quay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, Chris. Yes, it is quite a coincidence that we have this school background in common.
It's kind of cool. So I have to have a little bit of background, and you have such a diverse background. Could you maybe start by sharing what really drew you to medicine in the first place, and then kind of subsequently into the topic of cancer?
Well, this gets sort of really personal, but I'm happy to share it. So my father had rheumatic heart disease, which was a condition we don't see much anymore, but what basically is a strep infection that then there's autoantibodies and you end up getting some heart disease or kidney disease if you have scarlet fever from it. As a consequence, he had, artificial valves, in his 40s and 50s and died probably prematurely at age 70. He wanted me to be a doctor. He wanted me to live next door and take care of him. So it was kind of his goals in life. My goal was to become a scientist. And so I actually remember the day in undergraduate school when he called me from our home and he said, "I opened your letter to the University of Michigan Medical School. It was addressed to you, but I opened it anyway." He didn't say that,
Of
but that's
course.
what I'm thinking. And he said, "You've been accepted to medical school." And I remember I said something, I said a dirty word. He said, what am I going to do now? He said, "What do you mean? This is the best day of your life." I wanted to be a scientist. So I ended up getting a MD for my dad and a PhD for myself. Now at this point in my life, I look back and I say, "Dad, wow, thank you very much." Because although I am a scientist and I focus on laboratory research and the scientific method in that, having the MD background really lets me stand apart from the folks that didn't go to medical school and they have the desire to have a input in that field, but they don't have the background for it.
Interesting, right? Because at first, when you were saying us scientists, well, like in my mind, you landed there. I really see physicians as scientists, but what you're describing is where they live and reside, right? Is not to be scientific, is not to be as exploratory. It's to be delivering the
Yeah.
knowledge, right? Applying the knowledge. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, when I was, at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and then at Stanford Medical School, there were a lot of physicians that would come into the laboratory and do research. I mean, I actually had some future Nobel laureates in my lab using my equipment at Stanford, and so I was able to judge the PhD quality or the MD, and they just didn't have the background training to be good bench scientists. They sure tried hard, but they didn't have the training.
They needed more of that scientific focus.
Yeah.
And you got that with your PhD. And what was your PhD in again?
It was PhD. It was in chemistry,
Oh, in
biochemistry. But
chemistry.
yeah, so putting molecules together, taking them apart, and doing those sorts of things. At MIT, I transitioned into photochemistry, where I would use a precursor of a very reactive molecule. If you hit it with laser light, it would then react in milliseconds, and I could judge what was next to it. I could freeze frame a fluid biological process.
Wow. Okay, and then you carry that now today. That's pretty amazing. All right, so let's get to this kind of scary topic of today. Broad question: what is cancer? Like, what? I mean, this probably. I mean, it's got to be a ton of lectures, but but we have less than an hour,
Yeah.
and that's not the whole topic. What is cancer?
Well, I mean, it comes from the word tumor, which comes from the its root concept of a growth. So you should see it as a space filling lesion, or it has three-dimensional space if it's in the solid tissue. We call leukemias, which are single cells floating through the bloodstream, we call those cancers as well. But I think today we're going to focus on what I call epithelial cancers, the big four being lung, prostate, colon, and breast, that all come from the surface of that tube that represented a human growth at about day 10 or 12. So when the outside of the tube is the epithelium, and these are growths that occur from those cells. So if you can imagine, when you have breast cancer, even though it's deep in the breast, if you followed the skin surface down through the nipple into the growth, it's actually on the surface, just like the prostate is, just like the colon is, just like the lungs are. So they are on the surface of the body, just in a very convoluted pathway.
I think the kind of the analogy that I've heard is this pool noodles, and if you put water inside of a pool noodle, it's not really in the noodle, right? It's not right,
Exactly.
and so that comes through in breathing, right? So it's actually an exterior.
Bingo.
Exterior. That's
Exactly,
that's very
Chris.
interesting. Is it true? So this is a question I came by. Is it true that we all have varying quantities of cancer in our body at any given time?
Sure. So this was a concept that's probably now 20 or 30 years old, which is that cancers are not rare clinically speaking, they can be considered rare. Depending on your age, they're under 1%, they're under 5%. They're not. Half your patients walking in for the first time visit don't have cancer. But And so we thought it was rare. But then a concept began to be occurred was, gosh, we have this wonderful immune system that can recognize self and non-self, and can actually recognize self in a prior form, that is in an embryonic form. And so the concept that you're getting cancers a lot, and it's your immune system that is stopping them most of the time, and then the ones that escape are the ones that become clinical, is a very useful analogy. And it is true now that we have some very sensitive tools to look for early preclinical cancers in the body, that you can see cancers 5 years earlier, and then you can follow the patients, and a lot of times they never mature. So I think this idea that we're getting cancers fairly often, the immune system is killing them most of the time because they look foreign. And I can explain why they look foreign in a minute, and it's only the ones that have managed to evolve so close to your natural cells that they escape the immune system. Or if you have something fundamentally wrong with your immune system, a more aberrant cell can break through and become clinically significant.
Okay. And I think about this from one perspective as, I had a skin spot. They tested it. They did a biopsy. They actually called it precancerous, which in
Mhm.
my mind didn't make any sense. Like in my mind, it was either cancerous or not cancerous. But I
Mhm.
think what it means is it's cancerous, but not enough to be good. Like how would that, how does that fit? Like how is it precancerous?
Oh, this will be good. So, just remember for your audience here, the things I will say will sound definitive, but I'm probably talking 80% of the time, 70%. So
Mm.
whenever you make a rule in biology, there's always the exception that comes in and says, "Hey, think about me, think about me." But anyway, so the rule is that basically it takes 8 mutations to get to what is called clinically called cancer.
Mm.
And so, but the precancers means that your cells have one, two, three, four, up to 8 of those mutations. And so, 100 years ago, we started looking under the microscope and staining tissue with plant dyes to see the differences. And we were able to classify sort of normal cells, hyperplastic cells, too many cells, as I used to tell. So I've taught cytology to my 6-year-old who's now a high school junior. But anyway, there's normal
Wow.
cells, and then there's too many cells, but they look the same as the normal cells. That's hyperplasia. And then there are too many cells and they look kind of funny, and that's atypical hyperplasia. But you still can see that they have an orientation to the bottom to the body. So there's the body and there's the outside of the body, and you can see there's some sort of a gradient in your mind, from in the microscope. And then carcinoma in situ means there is no relationship there. And so we've known these 4 categories 10 years to go from one to the end, about 2.5 years apiece. And then recently, I want to say maybe 15 years ago, we began to look at mutations in these. And sure enough, you would start to see a few mutations and more until you finally got to the 7, 8, or 10 mutations that lead to cancer. So there's a wonderful overlap between what we've been looking at under the microscope for a century and now what's happening in the genome. So when someone says, when your clinician says you have precancer, they're probably not a molecular biologist. And a molecular biologist will say, yes, you have 4 of the 8 typical mutations in your genome that are going to lead to cancer if you don't take this out, etc.
Okay, so yeah, that makes it's exactly the same as I thought, and also this variability. It's interesting that you've got to have 8 genetic steps from a normal cell.
Pretty
That's
much.
a new piece of. All right, so how do these cancers occur? Like right, and we've got epithelial cancers we're focusing on. How do they tend to occur? Like what causes them to get that 8 genetic mutations away from your normal cells?
Yeah, yeah. Fascinating area. And a part of what you need to know when Steve Quay says something is fascinating, it means there's a lot of things we don't understand about it, which means it's a frontier, which means there's opportunity for new discovery, which is what every scientist lives for. So when a cell reproduces, and it reproduces in an abnormal fashion over and over and over again, the only way that can happen is if the genome has been fundamentally changed. That is, there's a mutation. But there's this whole dichotomy of whether the mutations happen as a primary event, and that's what leads to cancer, or whether there's a whole host of metabolic conditions in the cell that, for example, lead to high numbers of free radicals, which are themselves the primary event. It's a primary metabolic disease that's expressed by a high mutation rate that's then expressed as a cancer. And this is not taught in medical school. It's not commonly, well, it's certainly not accepted. But Warburg 100 years ago talked about the glucose effect, that cancers, for example, use primarily glucose, part of the glucose, and they don't use the full oxidative pathway. They're anaerobic, and so this can lead to free radical productions and ultimately high levels of mutation. So the idea that maybe cancer starts as a metabolic disease like diabetes or like obesity, and that the cancerous is only an expression of the environment of the cell, the environment being high mutation rate, pretty fascinating.
So, are there statistics like diabetics tend to get more cancers, or
Yeah.
obesity tends to drive more cancers?
Bingo, bingo. Yes, and yes, in both of those. Now, you can also invoke inflammation, which is higher in those conditions as well. Now, why would inflammation be associated with cancer? Because it is commonly. It's basically the remarkable finding that we have a couple enzymes in our body that help the DNA reproduce, but we have over 30 enzymes, proteins, that repair mistakes that are done in the process of reproduction. So imagine here, here's your charter, here's your job. You have a 6 billion letter book that you have to copy every 20 days, 30 days, 40 days, depending on the epithelium. In the gut, it's probably every 3 or 4 days. You have to copy that, and you have to copy it perfectly, all 6 billion letters. So the way it is done is it's not done by doing it slowly and making sure you get it right. It's done moderately quickly, and then you'll make 10,000, 20,000 mistakes in the first pass. And then these 30 plus enzymes will go back through and proofread and correct those errors. So in inflammation, your body is basically saying, "Hey, we've got to get cells out more quickly. There's something going on where we need to have some hyperplasia, cells growing faster than they should be." So what the body does is it sacrifices getting cells that are not completely through their repair cycle out into the system to say, basically, we need a cell to cover the skin, or we need a cell to cover the GI tract, or to cover the lungs, or the breast, and we're going to sacrifice having perfect fidelity on those 6 billion letters by getting something out there. That's that linkage. And I don't think a lot of people understand this concept, but it's pretty clear. I hope I'm clear with you. It's
Yeah.
clear when you explain inflammation. The cells have to grow faster. They don't have time to make their repairs, and then the downstream mutations are a result.
Interesting. Right. So definitely tied to inflammation, and also you were talking about free radicals, right? The extra free radicals that are produced. Does that inflammation tends to be associated with additional free radicals, I'm assuming?
Well, it is. And so, what is a free radical? Because this is really important. So, um, most of the carbon-carbon bonds have two electrons between the two carbons, or the carbon and hydrogen, or whatever. So there's two electrons there, and they're like little magnets, and they're in opposite directions. One's going up, one's going down. So if you bring two magnets together, they're really stable. That's a very happy situation. So the body, on purpose, to kill viruses, and inactivate. You can't kill a virus because it's not even alive yet. So I like to be very careful with my words, but
Mm.
either inactivating a virus or killing bacteria, the body has evolved enzymes that actually purposely produce free radicals, because what a free radical is you take one of those magnets away. Now you have a magnet that really is looking for something in the environment to recreate this stable situation. So it's relatively unstable, relatively reactive, and when it goes and hits something like DNA, or other proteins of that sort of thing, it produces a chemical damage, chemical difference, and then the body that's making the copy of the 6 billion letters sees a different letter. Remember, A and T and G and C always go together, and so if you get a mismatch because of a free radical chemical change on the DNA, you can switch that letter in the genome.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm kind of taking from this, because a lot of people, I think, until fairly recently, have thought of reactive oxygen species as just negative, but you're describing them as having a purpose of disrupting potentially bacteria and viruses. Did I understand that correctly?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. If there are genetic diseases where the immune system, mainly the macrophages, can't make free radicals, and these people have horrendous infections with things that most of us would never even know is a
Mm.
pathogen for humans. Sort of like the HIV immune deficiencies that led to some very strange infections. If you cannot make free radicals, you will get some very strange infections, primarily in the lung, because that's the contact with the outside world on a continuous basis. But so we absolutely need free radicals made by our immune system to kill these microorganisms, and those are not the ones that typically cause cancer. The typical ones that cause cancer are leaks in the mitochondrial electron transport chain. So the way we make energy, as I don't know if you're around any kids who are teenagers, but there's this meme that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and I do not know where its source is, but kids will dance to it. They will make T-shirts to it. It's quite the thing in high schools these days. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So so the mitochondria starts with electrons come in at sort of the left-hand side, and they get passed down as the electron is slowly reduced its energy until oxygen comes in and makes water. That's the final step of that process. And so if one of those electrons happens to get out of the mitochondria into the cytoplasm, a lot of mischief occurs, and so you want that to be coupled. For example, why do people take coenzyme Q? Why should they take coenzyme Q? As a later in life is it's something you make. It's the last handoff. It gets the electron from the last of the chain. It's the one that hands it to oxygen to make water. If you don't have enough of that, that system says, I got this electron, there's no CoQ here, so I'm going to throw it into the cytoplasm. And you suddenly get a rise in free radicals, you suddenly get a rise in mutations. Not a good thing.
And that's CoQ10, right? Commonly CoQ10, is that? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And it's not very soluble, water soluble. It's not very absorbed well. So a lot of the best formulations have absorption enhancers in the supplements. But it's a dietary supplement because you can get it in foods, but you can also get it in concentrated form. And I highly recommend it. And if you have a patient, on a statin, statins prevent the production of coenzyme Q. It's kind of crazy. So because statins prevent cholesterol synthesis, CoQ is on that pathway. You go down, so you're going down towards cholesterol, and about halfway down you make a left turn and you make CoQ under normal circumstances. If you statins stop the waterfall at the top, so you not only don't make cholesterol, you don't make CoQ. One of the gentlemen in Texas who got the Nobel Prize for cholesterol metabolism actually got a patent of combining a statin with coenzyme Q.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Because as you describe it, it's a necessary component. So I know that my business partner is on a statin. I will ask if he's been supplementing with CoQ10 because that's certainly something that he needs to.
Yeah.
So I remember reading an article about a cellular theory that cancer is a numbers game, and the more cells that you have as a living being, the more opportunities for cancer that you should have, like according to this theory. But elephants actually have, obviously significantly more cells, but have significantly lower incidences of cancer. Is this theory even relevant? And what do we need to do to become more like elephants?
That theory makes no sense to me.
Oh,
I mean,
good, right?
Yeah.
I think, and it was just presented that way, which is like, it kind of drove the first question. Is like, do we all have varying amounts of cancer in our body? And you're saying, well, we're still kind of debating about that, or where does that really sit? And if you look at the genetic mutations, then maybe we all have precancerous cells in our bodies. Like maybe that's a more true statement. And then to say that we actually have cancers is not true. And then
I think what I would do to answer that would be to focus on some of the things I've said and try to apply them to this particular problem. If cancer comes about, or precancer, I should say, I guess better ways, comes about because you're going through the cell cycle faster than you should be. Maybe you need to do a study of, well, which animals which animals have a lowered metabolism that allows them to go through the cycle slower, and therefore make the proper repairs more, which means they would have less mutations, and fewer mutations, excuse me, not less, fewer mutations and fewer cancers. So I would look at it that way. So I wouldn't be surprised if animals that hibernate, for example, that have the ability to really slow their metabolism down, may have a correspondingly decrease in their cancer incidence, because of that ability to really get those repairs done and get those mutations taken out of the genome.
Well, I'll have to dig up that article if I can find it. And you're talking about slowing down the process. So maybe it's simple. Maybe elephants are just not as inflamed.
Mhm.
Right.
Not as inflamed, and their overall metabolism may be slower.
Yeah. As it relates to the amount of cells that they have in.
Correct.
How much of cancer risk is genetic?
So you get one copy of your 6 billion cells from your father and one copy from your mother. They get thrown together at the point of conception, and there will be between 20 and 30 mistakes in your genome that weren't in either of your parents. So you start with a baseline of 20 or 30 differences from your parents. Now remember, it almost is stochastic. It almost is Russian roulette with a gun with 6 billion barrels and only 20 or 30 bullets. So most of them are completely benign. Most of them are completely inert, have no effect on you whatsoever, and that's both encouraging and maybe a little bit frightening about the probabilities of getting this one really bad one. But so, for example, childhood cancers, so if it takes 9 months to go from a single cell to a human being, if you make a genetic mistake in that time frame and the cells are growing approximately the same as you get older, as you start to between 1 and 4, you're growing less quickly as you were in the fetus, but you're still growing pretty fast. So childhood cancers are mistakes that were made in that 9-month process that then express themselves in the first 3 or 4 or 5 years of life. So that's that. And then once you get past that window, um, the mistakes you make during fetal development are one set of mistakes, and they lead to the childhood cancers, which can pretty devastating, but also pretty rare. Thank goodness. Some of the cancers that you see in childhoods are 500 to a couple thousand in the whole United States in 1 year. And then you get into the space where you don't have cancer for a long time, but you're acquiring these 1 in 8 mutations, and then you eventually get a cancer beginning 35, 40, 40, and up from there. And it does go up pretty much exponentially with each decade.
Do you need to be more concerned that you will have cancer if your relatives, like how does cancer get passed genetically, or does it?
Well, certainly does. So breast cancer is what Atossa Therapeutics is trying to prevent with our program to treat the high density on mammography. So it's a good example. So if you have family history of breast cancer, which qualifies as a woman who has a mother who has it, a grandmother who has it, or an aunt who has, or a sister, I should, so all of the generational ladies around a particular woman. If you have a relative there, you have about a 3 or 4-fold increase chance of having breast cancer. Now, having said that, Chris, only 1 in 12 breast cancers are in a woman who has a family history. So 11 out of 12 have no family history. It's a bolt of lightning for them. So, you can sort of true unrelated. So yes, it's an increased risk if you have family history of it, but most cancers are just acquired off of a background in which there is not an increase in cancer.
Okay, so now let's talk about what's really impacting those 11, right? So genetics is you got a 3 times increase if women around you, in the case of cancer, and then out of 12, 11 of them don't have that situation. So their mother or their grandmother doesn't have it, their aunts don't have it, their sisters don't have it. You've talked about metabolism. Is there anything? What would be the kind of key things that you would look at? And I know cancer, smoking, like that's a smoking gun, literally, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the key things that would drive it for those 11?
Sure. So, and I think I want to include the smoking in there to give you a concepts around this. So, as you know, there was this huge litigation around smoking causing cancer, and I think that things would have been different if nature hadn't provided an answer to the lawyers, and I'll explain. So, one of the challenges I think for the litigation was to prove that if you smoked, you actually had, the linkage, the actual linkage between the components of tobacco or the components of the tar it's not tobacco, it's the tar that you get, and the production of cancer. It turned out that there is a specific mutation in a specific spot that happens in a specific way that is only caused by the chemistry of tar with DNA. So there's
Wow.
no other place in nature where DNA damage has this particular spot and this particular chemical reaction. That became an absolute provable link. So every person that had this mutation, you could go into court and say, Judge, I know you didn't have biology, but that's okay. We're gonna get something you understand. Every time you see X, Y, and Z mutation, it only could have come from tar. And I have 400 people in a class, and so they all got it from the cigarettes. So that's a little bit unusual, actually, and you don't very often see that much of that that uh,
Precise.
that precise, thank you, precise
Yeah.
linkage between a particular chemical change and a particular thing from the environment. But let's talk about breast cancer, which has this remarkable, not re- yeah, remarkable issue, which is that we now know estrogen itself, which of course defines women in all of the features that it leads to, uh, actually causes DNA damage. It actually is a
Mhm.
carcinogen. So, when women, from the time they go through puberty until menopause, are getting a monthly spike of estrogen as their body prepares for a to have a child, and so every month the ovary, the uterus, and the breast are all getting stimulated, getting high levels of estrogen, and then they're having the opportunity to have estrogen-driven mistakes.
Mm.
So this ties in with all sorts of observations, which is, for example, if girls have too much uh, fast food, high calorie diets, I guess is the best way to put it. And, the easiest way to have a high calorie, the acronym for high calorie diet is fast food because it's the most calorie dense food that's ever existed in the world. So they have a lot. They get a little bit overweight or maybe even obese from 0 to 10, and then they go into puberty earlier. So what does that mean? Well, that means that they're going to have more monthly events of cycles, mutations between when they go into puberty and menopause than other women. Girls that have puberty late. So if you puberty at 8 years old, puberty at 15 years old, there's a marked difference in the cancer incidence just for girls in that space. Um, so that's one. So approaches to lower estrogen. So you don't have to do it pharmaceutically. If a woman does resistance training, if a woman does aerobic training to the point where they have quite a high level of fitness and a very good body mass index, they're going to have a lower estrogen level than a woman who doesn't do those activities, and they're going to have a lower incidence of cancer because of that. And then, of course, there's the inflammation that's going to affect every cancer in the world. If you're throwing inflammation on top of the monthly estrogen spikes, you're going to get more breast cancer as a consequence.
So one of the things that for me kind of begs the question, because and this is inherent in the nature of a woman centered conversation, but you're talking about estrogen being carcinogen, which blows me away, right? And but it makes sense. I mean, maybe not evolutionarily, but but it makes sense because that's what the data says. In that initial opening, I mentioned that 1 in 6 women will die of. So the chances of cancer are a little bit higher in men. Is testosterone a carcinogen like that? Just because of the parallel?
No, no, it doesn't. It doesn't seem to be. It doesn't seem to be.
Okay.
It's probably it's a little bit of the lifestyles where men do not have as healthy a lifestyle as women, and they do not go to the doctor as frequently. They don't take care of themselves as well. But it's some of
Okay.
those. And then going back to the other analogy in breast cancer, which is really quite unique, and I don't want to just focus on that, but the breast is the only organ that doesn't develop during fetal life. So when you're a fetus, and then in utero, you have this placenta filtering all the things the mother is eating, in her diet and that sort
Mm,
of thing. So you're getting a filtered version of the world, and the placenta does a lot of good things to prevent the fetus from getting toxins and that sort of thing. So even if a mother doesn't have such a good diet, for example, the placenta will make sure the baby gets this absolutely beautiful, if it was a nutrition class, A+ version of
right.
the diet. That doesn't happen in girls going through puberty. So one of the things I like to teach about is you should you should not should be very careful about what your daughter eats between the time she starts puberty and she finishes, usually a 3 to 4 year period of time. There was a recent paper, and I actually did a public service announcement about this, a recent paper that showed that there's a particular product in fast foods which are created by meats and fats, sugar, and very high temperature cooking. They're called AGE products, and that these actually cause some of the early mutations in the breast where you get hyperplasia and atypical hyperplasia, which are precursors to future cancer. So you can actually correlate fast food. When fast food gets introduced into a country, typically Asia didn't have them, and they introduced them. 20 years later, you would see a spike in breast cancer. It's like, okay, I see this
Wow.
correlation. Is there a causation? And now we know there is a causation. The things that occur with high temperature cooking and with high sugar and protein and fats together, that's the triad of badness, lead to this particular chemical, which then leads to particular changes in the genome. And when the breast is developing, that's a particularly vulnerable period of time. Just like doing a chest x-ray in a girl who's going through puberty, you have to have a very high threshold for doing that. You want to try to make whatever diagnosis you're doing in another way, because there's just no need to radiate a breast that's undergoing development, because radiation, again, causes water to break apart, and a free radical of the water is formed, and you go from there.
Hey, super quick break from the podcast. Hopefully you're loving it. This is a way you can support the podcast and take advantage of a great offer. We're offering 50% off of one of our MCT bottles. MCT is an amazing oil. Add the ESS60 molecule to it. It's even more amazing. All you got to do is leave a review on iTunes. Send us a notification that you've left that review. We'll get you a coupon code that'll get you 50% off of our MCT oil and free shipping. Back to the podcast.
So you're surprised that estrogen is a carcinogen, not really surprised that that fast food is a carcinogen, and what a what a bad thing we're perpetrating on the planet by spreading our fast food. I think at least Americans are often happy to see, oh, I have some local food, but you should probably stay away from it. Maybe food is a generous description. What is the role of the gut biome when it comes to cancer?
Oh, I love this. So, what is the microbiome? It's now literally considered, the microbiome is the organisms, mostly bacteria, but actually they're also viruses of bacteria, bacteriophage they're called. But it's the 300 to 500 different species in different proportions that occupy mostly the large colon, mostly the large bowel, also a little bit in the small bowel, but mostly the colon. And it's you probably have a pound of these organisms in your body at any one time, and it's literally as an organ. It talks to the immune system. There's crosstalk between the microbiome and the immune system. There's actually crosstalk between the microbiome and the brain. There was a recent publication. It's 2 weeks old, so the ink's barely wet, barely dry on the publication paper itself, showing that if you take the microbiome from Alzheimer's patients and you transplant it into germ-free mice. So if you
Mm, I
deliver
remember
mice
that.
by
Yeah.
cesarean section, you put them in a box, you feed them. They don't have any bacteria, so they're a good experimental model. So you put them into the gut of the mice. They develop the lesions in the brain that are associated with Alzheimer's. So think about that. So the microbiome is different in Alzheimer's than normals, and the microbes that occupy that may be giving signals to the brain that can lead to some of the changes that can lead to Alzheimer's downstream. So the microbiome is a fascinating organism. I've done quite a bit of studying on it. For example, when you take a child and you give them antibiotics gratuitously is what happens a lot. We've got 200 million antibiotics prescriptions a year for probably 10% of the infections that are necessary. A lot of times the prescription for a child with an antibiotic is you're treating the mother or the father. You're not treating the child.
Mm.
You're trying to satisfy their need for something,
Yeah.
because a lot of the infections are viral. But anyway, it's now shown that 9 months after a single 2-week antibiotic prescription, a child's microbiome has still not returned to normal. We don't know if it ever returns to normal. It may be damaged in perpetuity by that 2-week process of an antibiotic, because it sort of kills everything and kills everything selectively. The microbiome is absolutely critical to our health. It's not well understood. It's not well understood how we manage it, if I could call it that. Probiotics and prebiotics are the typical ways people think of changing or modifying their microbiomes. There's some science, a little pseudoscience around these topics, but they are a very important part of science and medicine.
Yeah, I think and I could be grossly misquoting this or misdescribing this. In Lifespan, they talked about, and if it wasn't there, it was something I was reading about the same time I was reading that book about kind of fecal transplants,
Mhm.
and you just talked about like here's one as part of a study, and I was there's this phrase, all I need is the blood of a young boy to be young again, right? And actually, you need their poop. Like, I
You
think
need both. Yeah.
yeah, you need both, right? It's pretty amazing. And I'm actually preparing for another interview, and her name's Colleen Cutcliffe. She kind of has a product on the market, Akkermansia, which is one of the bacteria in your stomach, in your gut biome. And she really kind of, one of her things that pushed her to get into that business, to open that business, was her daughter was premature, and they tend to give a lot of antibiotics to premature children, and that the data is really clear on all sorts of negative side effects. And
Mhm.
I have twins. They were born early. They were in NICU. The chances of them not getting a slew of antibiotics is probably zero. And so I'm looking forward to that interview to kind of address that. Are you aware of any, and maybe this is what's going to come, down the line, of any kind of direct to cancer gut microbiome studies, and like, hey, we know this has the impact in this way, similar to the one you shared about Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I think the most direct studies. Well, so I again, I have a PhD in chemistry, so I like to start from chemistry and then go to biology and then go to medicine if I can. So the the flat molecule porphyrin that holds iron in your hemoglobin in your red blood cells has to be metabolized, because your red blood cells turn over every 120 days if you're normal, and then you have to recycle the iron. You recycle the porphyrin rings, and those are recycled as bilirubins. So and bilirubins are useful in and of themselves because they act like a soap and they act like a surfactant. So when you get your food, what you need to do is break it down into smaller units until they're colloidal, which means they're under a micron in size. And to do that, you need something on the surface to change the surface activity coefficients, and a lot of those are bilirubin. So gallbladder is full
What's
of
that word?
bilirubin.
Bilirubin. Okay.
Yeah, and they're beautiful colors. They're yellows and greens and things. When you get a bruise, it starts out looking sort of blackish red, because then it's blood outside the vascular system in your tissue, and then you watch it go through different color changes. Those are the bilirubins being broken down
Wow.
locally. When you have a child like my own who had a high bilirubin at birth, one of the ways you can treat that is with UV light. You can cause the bilirubin to have a chemical reaction just from the UV light itself, because it's so reactive. It has free radicals itself. And so I remember when our daughter was born, and it was, medicine's not very efficient, but this really worked. Like 24 hours later, we get a knock on the door, and there's this team there with a bed, a light bed, a UV light bed, and the instructions for us to put her in it because they had done a blood test, like an hour earlier, and they want to get on this because it can affect the brain, early brain
Mm.
development. If you don't get rid of the bilirubin, you want to do it as quickly as possible because your IQ is dropping by the hour. I'm exaggerating, but so the point is that but bilirubins go into the gut and then they get recycled back into the gallbladder. But some of them go into the colon if you have too much or the wrong kind. And certain bacteria will make a carcinogen from your own bilirubin. Okay,
Mm.
so that's a correlation between you're making the bilirubin and it goes to your gut, and there's a bacteria that then makes a carcinogen. And this chemical, this in and of itself, is on the list in California of this is a known carcinogen. So that's the most direct link. Again, I'm trying to be a scientist, so there is not a signature in the DNA that this mutation was caused by this bilirubin, modified chemical. So that is missing, but everything else is kind of pretty tight in terms of correlation.
Okay. So it may be in the future that we get a more kind of concrete process of how that's negatively impacting, but already bilirubin getting further down into the colon with a particular type of bacteria. I'm going to assume, well, Dr. Gundry talks about good gut bacteria and bad gut bacteria. I have a suspicion that they're all a necessary bacteria. Like, are there bad? I wonder if there's bad ones that we really just don't need and shouldn't have, and maybe that's one of them. Or is it we just need some, and based on our diet, their ratios oscillate, and that can be problematic. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I do, and I actually have a patent on this. So it's 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 computationally beyond the human mind. When I got this patent about 10 years ago, AI was not where it should be. But the computational problem, Chris, is that let's assume you have 450 bacteria naturally, but their ratios are also important. So they actually are able to establish a community where the community size of a given species is relatively stable over a months to year time frame, although it does gradually change. So elderly microbiomes are different than young microbiomes, as you point out. There's an aging microbiome phenotype as well as what you look like outside. But anyway, so you have this property of 400 to 450 microorganisms that are in different proportions, and then the orthogonal change is that they're making different enzymes at any point in time. So each of them probably have 5 to 6,000 different proteins they could make. So you have a matrix of 5 to 6,000 proteins that can do different things metabolically on the x-axis, and 400 to 500 different bacteria on the y-axis. And so the biochemical phenotype of your microbiome is the product of that. So what's 4,000 times 500? It's a big number. So that's the space you have to think in terms of saying, well, how do I modify this, and what does this look like in health, and what does it look like in disease? And so that was what that effort was done. I think actually with AI, we will be able to begin to attack this, to say the AI will go in and do the Monte Carlo simulations of this 2 million event space that I've described here, and come up with what is ideal and what is non-ideal, and then you'll be able to supplement.
Well, and again, in preparing for this interview with Colleen, she spoke about the fact that Akkermansia wasn't even really known to exist because it's a anaerobic, I think is the correct phrase. So it's a bacteria, once exposed to oxygen, it goes away. We actually needed the ability to identify the genes in order to understand that it was even there. And then once you understand it's there, then okay, they have a production process that is devoid of oxygen, obviously. So we really are at a kind of a budding stage of understanding the gut biome. But again, we're just also at such an amazingly fast paced. Like we're going to know more in 3 years probably than we did 1 year ago, right? Like it's going to go. It just keeps getting exponentially faster, and that makes
Yeah,
it.
no. When I graduated from medical school, medicine knowledge was doubling about every 10 years. It's now down to 4 years. So
Yeah.
the quantity of information in the medical available to the medical practitioner is doubling every 4 years. It's
So
not quite
you've
Moore's law, which is every 18 to 24 months, but it's getting there.
is it so you've experienced this as a practicing physician scientist. How does that feel? Does at times it feel overwhelming? Like, okay, now I have to read like 4x papers than I did, even or 2x papers than I did 4 years ago. Like, and I was reading a lot back then.
So, Chris, it does. But I do want to tell a story. When I was in graduate school, I would go to the library, and I would, because I was looking for a particular journal article, one article. And I had this crazy habit of saying, hey, why don't I just read the article before mine and the article after mine as just an exercise in broadening my knowledge? Journals are not put together, the articles are not put together thematically, so
Mm.
they're just totally random in sort of the order they came in. And so I started doing that. So I'd read the article about my topic, and then I had two articles on either side of it that were completely off topic. About 6 to 8 weeks after I started doing this, my fellow graduate students, we'd have lunch together, that sort of thing, and someone would say, "I got this problem," that sort of thing. He says, "Well, I read an article about that, a couple of months ago," and this became such a self-reinforcing habit that it became kind of the foundation of what allowed me to do what I do, which is basically my creativity is around Venn diagrams of bringing together things that no one else would connect, but there's this tiny space of connection there. Um, Search engines assist you in doing that. So actually, it's surprising how well you can actually keep up with what's important even as this expanding process goes on, because you start to go down, and the search engine helps you find a couple articles, and then inside those articles will be references that you need to see. So you can very quickly get through even a tenfold increase in articles in a field in a fashion that gives you the 80-20 of what you need to then understand something and make a contribution.
Yeah, I think it's and just like exactly what this talk is about is this consolidation of information. So you're out there absorbing and actually cutting edge researching, breast cancer, and then that can come back and be broken down for an audience that doesn't have the time to dig into all of this. Um, uh, we're coming up on the 50-minute mark, and I want to ask kind of one last question, then I've got some wrap up questions. And what are the positive steps that we can take to reduce our risk of cancer? Like, what are the things that the audience could do today to positively impact, to not be the 1 in 5 or not be the 1 in 6?
Yep. And this is a really important topic because I can tell you that your doctors will not know this.
Mm.
Okay. So we get 4 years, we get probably, 10,000 hours of medical training, both in the hospital and in the classroom. I was on the faculty of Stanford Medical School for a decade. We learn nothing about proper nutrition in that process, yet nutrition, diet, and lifestyle probably make a 60 to 80% contribution to the risk of breast cancer. So, and your doctors don't know that, and so they're not going to give you necessarily advice around this. They're pretty much in the mode of diagnosis, what small pill can I give you, next patient.
Mm.
And when you think about it, pharmaceuticals are actually amazing. Your body weighs 70 million milligrams. So 154 pounds,
Mm.
US measurements is 70 kilograms, which is 70 million milligrams. So to think that you can take something that is 1 milligram, 2 milligrams, 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, you're taking a 10 milligram something every day and you're trying to affect 70 million milligrams. It's actually pretty impressive.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's not very effective. So
Mm.
what you need to do is do your own research, use your own sense of things. Look, I think we honestly have a subconscious or something that tells us when we have a good lifestyle, when we don't,
Mm.
and is trying to advise us. We all know that drinking too much is bad. We all know that smoking is bad. We all know that lack of exercise is bad. We all know that some of these foods, when you can get 2,000 calories, which is more than a 24-hour period, in 30 minutes at McDonald's, that isn't right. You
Yeah.
don't have to be a scientist, for goodness
Yeah.
sakes. I mean, um, we were designed to barely have enough calories to eat a huge amount of roughage. So the efficiency of what we were eating, so the calories divided by the weight of what we were eating. I mean, we were chewing on sticks in the middle of winter when there was nothing to eat. So we had a very low calorie density. So we were getting a lot of the roughage, which forms prebiotics for our microbiome, because some of the things you eat that you can't digest, your microbiome can. You're nourishing your microbiome in that fashion, and we've evolved in that environment. Now, having said that, I want to get back to something, Chris, I hadn't mentioned, but you keep saying, well, why would estrogen be a carcinogen?
Mm.
We evolved. Remember what we evolved for. We evolved to reproduce and have children, and we evolved to live long enough because of our huge intelligence capacity, not capacity, requirement.
Mm.
We are not the toughest animal on the planet. We are not the fastest animal on the planet, but we need to be the smartest animal on the planet. So that means we have to evolve to have not only parents to give us babies, but grandparents to help raise the babies while the whole community is going on. So evolution is primarily to have kids, and then there's a secondary layer that we've now seen, which is grandparents are absolutely critical in the overall scheme of evolution. But beyond that, we're kind of dead weight. And so when cancers are happening, at 70 or 80 or 90, there's never an evolutionary process to get rid of those, because nobody's reproducing in that time frame, and therefore the people that are good at living to that age and the people that are bad are not really being segregated out.
Yeah.
So estrogen can be a carcinogen, because if it only affects you at age 70, it's not going to be selected against,
Yeah.
and so you got to keep that in mind.
Well, and that's exactly when people start talking about like a traditional diet, the diet the caveman ate, the caveman diet, the paleo diet. I was like, I'm not convinced that that's a right strategy, right? It feels natural, right? It's a natural diet that we kind of evolved on. But that diet was to get us to 35 or 40, right? Like it really wasn't like, oh, anything over 40 on that diet is like potentially draining that village, right? Like you're eating
Yes.
and you're not contributing.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so and you mentioned that there's a subconscious understanding how we feel. One of the talks is going to be about that. A
Oh,
really good
good.
friend of mine is a human behavior expert, and he works on the subconscious. He's fabulous at it. It's just amazing. And you and I could have an interesting conversation about that. All right. So nutrition, right? Like that's one of the key things, and any kind of broad based, we've got limited time. So nutrition people, and we're having lots of conversations in this summit about nutrition. What else would we want to be focused on to kind of help prevent cancer?
Well, I mean, so again, anything that lowers inflammation, and there are things either dietarily, avoiding the fast food frying process. Basically, if you think about the temperature you cook your foods at versus the production of pro-cancerous molecules, the higher the temperature, the more likely you are to produce them. So, boiling chicken is much better than frying chicken, and then the higher the temperature you fry it at, and so what is it, the blackened chicken, the Cajun style, very delicious. But and why is it delicious? Well, the interesting, before we had refrigerators, if you had if you had a piece of an animal you'd killed 3 weeks ago, you probably still want to eat it, but after 3 weeks, sitting in the back of the cave, so what you would do is you would cook it. You'd probably overcook it to sort of be sure that you've killed all the microorganisms, and that overcooking produces, the tasty skin at Thanksgiving on the turkey.
Mm.
So we have evolved to really taste-wise, we've evolved to appreciate these things that represent the overcooking. It's a bad combination, but again, we're only evolving to make it to 30 or 40, as you point out. So just having a good diet. We're omnivores, so that means that we are meant to eat meat, we are meant to eat plants, we are, and omnivore means just that. So an all plant diet, an all meat diet is kind of the extremes, and probably you're off the edge of the healthiest part of that. And then I think there are a place for supplements, because a lot of the way we make foods now may involve selection for certain aspects of a plant or a vegetable that size, for example, or tastiness that may not give the full spectrum of phytochemicals that plants have. So an important concept is there are about 200,000 phytochemicals. What's a phytochemical? It's a chemical a plant makes, because plants live a long time and they have a lot of advantages, but they can't move. And so if a predator is an animal and can walk up to them or fly up to them as an insect, they need to have things to try to ward that off because they can't run away. And so these are what are called phytochemicals. And they have, I mean, the whole pharmaceutical industry came out of the phytochemical natural process, and then
That's
we started adding chemicals to it. So there are phytochemicals that can do almost anything a pharmaceutical can, maybe not as much specificity, but with broader activity in that. So fundamental principle is you just want as big a variety as you can get. Simple study where they had exactly the same calories, exactly the same mixtures of plants and meats in the diet, but they had plants from a larger genus of plants and a small genus of plants. They looked at free radicals. They looked at free radical damage 1 year out, and the ladies that had the largest diversity of plants, on a like a taxonomy, like a botany class, what's the biggest diversity you can get in your diet, had the fewest free radicals and the fewest free radical damage in their white blood cells. So that's an argument for saying get as don't eat broccoli's good for you, but not broccoli 7 days a week. Broccoli one day, and then bok chow or whatever. In China they have, in Asia here there's uh, more of a tropical variety, a bigger variety of potential vegetables that you can have than perhaps in America. But you can get those in the Whole Foods or that sort of thing. I think there is an interest in more of a world view of what vegetables are being eaten, and then let's add them to our diet. And it can be fun, and then it's also very, very good for you.
Yeah, yeah. So an increase. Not only do you want the biodiversity in your gut biome, you want the biodiversity in the food that you're eating to probably support that gut biome, but ultimately make sure that the phytochemicals are available for your unbelievably intelligent body to know what to do with. Right? Like that seems to be it. All right, so nutrition. I don't want to get into it, but exercise, good, right? Like clearly, exercise, sleep is got to be in there. And then if you just look in classic longevity, then it's relationships, and I assume those all have positive impacts on cancer. Just to kind of keep this really brief.
Well, they have positive impacts on quality of life and longevity. Again, I'm going to be very careful and
Yeah,
say I don't
yeah,
I don't know, for
please.
example, relationships have an effect on cancer, but sleep is important. Sleep hygiene, and sleep is pretty simple. Go to bed at the same time, get up at the same time, and the 3 to 4 hours before that, don't exercise because that actually turns up your metabolic rate. So get your exercise in earlier in the day, and get rid of your screens, because the melatonin that you need. You know, just imagine you're in a cave, and so during the day you can read and do whatever you want. As the sun goes down and as the cave darkens, you need to respect that.
Yeah.
In my house, I don't tell the people in my house what I do, but starting at 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock, I'm gradually turning the lights down. I'm gradually making it darker and darker, as a natural process. And I'm the sleep police with my children. So 9 o'clock, they're getting ready for bed, and 9:30, the lights are out, and they've used no screens for the 2 hours before that. So
You might be called Alexa at our house because I'm using her to like dim the lights.
good for you. Good for you.
This has been awesome. All right, so kind of wrap up questions. These are questions I'm asking each of our speakers. Do you have a target age that you want to live to?
Yeah. So I have a daughter in high school, and I got started late in this process. So I think the best way to answer that for me is quality of life.
Mm.
Right now, I've been very lucky to not have any chronic diseases. I'm in my 70s. I have no chronic diseases at this point. I'm very thankful for that. I've got a little knee problem from a lifetime of long distance running, where I wasn't religious about staying on non-artificial surfaces. I ran on
Mhm.
asphalt, I ran on cement occasionally. We didn't evolve for that. So I've had one knee surgery about 10 years ago. I may have some others coming up, but knock on wood, I've been healthy. But I've had friends, who've gotten cancers, gotten leukemias and things, and then begun to have quality of life degradation in that process. And then so there probably does come a point where, you have to think about, is this something that you're happy with?
Yeah.
It really is a quality of life issue. I think that what everyone would like to do would be to square, what they call square it off. So you quality of life continuously, and then you pass away in your sleep, something like
The
that.
the other good example I heard was a candle flame, because it burns the same, right, until it's out, right? Like, so it's all the way down, and then it's
Yeah,
definitely a square wave.
very
Um,
nice analogy.
how long do you think humans can live, right? So Dr. David Sinclair talks about this information theory of aging, and that potentially it's infinite. What's your thoughts?
So, um, I think right now, well, one of the challenges is that the things that we learn that help with the aging process, um, get applied at different points in the time frame, because if someone finds something really really valuable, they start applying it to themselves at 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. So we never know what would happen if you start applying that, and when you're 5 years old, 6 years old. Um, it looks like about 120 is probably the theoretical maximum age.
Okay.
There just are certain insults in the genome that happen. There's certain cumulative mistakes that happen. Um, we lose our mitochondria powerhouses, the cells where, our young cells have 30 or 40,000 of those, and our older cells have 10,000. I mean, when an older person says they don't have energy, they're not making it up or anything. They only have 5 or 10,000 mitochondria. Young person has 30,000. It's like, how many batteries in your light and how bright is your light? It all is correlated. So, there was a woman. I think she's 119, in France, and she passed away, and they had blood samples on her and that sort of thing. And so your immune system, that is white cells, red cells, all of this, comes from one stem cell that then divides into all the different branches.
Mm.
And we have maybe a million, couple million stem cells when we're younger. This woman at 119 had one stem cell left. So she had one cell that was making all of her red cells, all of her white cells, all of her macrophages. I mean, this poor little cell, after 119 years, was doing everything all by itself. But that's one of the things that you have to think about if you want to live beyond that. So, um, I think it's a reasonable idea to try to get to maybe something like 120. It is more important to be active, and
Mm.
to be healthy, and to have a quality of life. Um, the worst thing is someone who's 95 and has no friends and is blind, and can't even walk around. That's not an achievement at some point.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with you. Um, and that poor stem cell.
Yeah, it was just in the article was written in the context of, isn't it amazing that this woman's, for at least a couple of years, this one cell was supporting, because they could follow the genetics, so they could see that all the cells made in the last year came from that one cell genetically.
Wow.
So it really was a one cell doing 2 years worth of work, and probably making 100 million cells,
Yeah.
one cell.
Well, and what an amazing technology to be able to even come up with that answer like that. That's amazing. Um,
Yep.
what are 2 to 3, and you've probably touched on these, right? Because we were talking in the broader scope of cancer. But what 2 to 3 protocols, habits, mindsets, let's call them shortcuts, would you share in the quest of a longer life, a longer health span?
Well, yeah, there's four. We are animals, so we have a brain, but we're basically animals with a brain, and don't ever forget that. So, there's four aspects of fitness:
Mm,
cardiovascular, which is heart and lungs; strength. So basically, starting at age 40, you're losing 1% of your muscle every year. It's replaced by fat if your weight stays the same. So if you brag about keeping your weight the same for 10 years after 40, it means that 10% of your muscle has been replaced by fat. Muscle has a high metabolic rate, fat has a low metabolic rate, so your BMI is going down. So
mm,
resistance training. So we've talked about cardiovascular, heart and lung, resistance training, lifting weights, and you have to do the whole body. So a lot of men look in the mirror and lift weights for the front of their body, and their back goes to pot, and they end up with misalignments.
mm,
Then range of motion. which is, absolutely critical. And one of the hallmarks of an older person is their stride is reduced in size. Their step pace is reduced. You can actually, there's a chart of what is your biologic age versus your walking rate. It's
Mm.
pretty linear, so you can work on that because it's range of motion. So your steps get smaller because your range of motion gets smaller. And finally, balance. So being able to stand on one foot with your eyes closed and not touching anything is a trait of people under 40. It becomes a challenge for people over 40, but you can train your balance system. There'll be a limit because the balance system requires the speed of your proprioceptors. So you got little devices in all of your appendages saying where you are in three-dimensional space. So they're talking to your spine, and then your spine is talking to your muscles to keep things in the same spot. That's why
Mm.
you can stand up and not use. You close your eyes, you're taking away one of your feedback loops. But at some point in time, the rate of electrical movement starts to get out of whack, and you get a asynchronous. So people who shake, they've gotten into the asynchronous phase of that. So, but working on all of those on a daily basis can really be impactful because what you want to do is you want to replicate what you had when you were 40. So if
Mm.
you have a particular balance when you're 40 and you can look up what a person at 40 is, you can focus on that. I have a little device which is flat on the top and is shaped on the bottom, and so it's for testing your balance. And I use it, 5 or 10 minutes a day while I stand to do emails. Range of motion is yoga and things like that. Resistance training is lifting weights in the gym, and cardiovascular is some sort of walking 6,000 to 10,000 steps a day, or light walking, jogging on a very artificial surface for your knees. And you should think about that. And these are all parts of a healthy living. Having some sort of a spiritual life,
Mm.
thinking about what is the meaning of life, why are you here, what are you giving to the world. Because I think, I learned it as a Boy Scout, but then you apply, you make the campsite cleaner than it was. When you get a campsite, you make
Mm.
it cleaner when you leave it. And, having the world be a better place because of your life is a huge motivating thing. And it can be something as simple as your granddaughter, or a flower garden that faces the street. You don't have to be, in the United Nations or something big. It's probably more important to be one-on-one in your contributions in the world.
To be local. All right, Dr. K, how can people contact you?
Yeah. So I have a website, www.drquay.com. That's drquay.com. Provide feedback. I provide blogs. There's a place to sign up for emails where I'll send you tips because yeah, I still do. In teaching at Stanford on Sundays, I had an inch of paper because there was no computers in those days. I would have an inch of paper. I would sit on my patio and read medical things that seemed interesting to me, and I shared them with people. And I still do that to this day.
So the best way is through your website.
That's it.
Excellent. What in the near future are you excited about?
So we have the audacious prospect. When I started Atossa Therapeutics, Princess Atossa, the first woman in recorded history with breast cancer,
Mm.
we would like to prevent breast cancer. And so 10 years ago, when I started this company, I asked a simple question: why isn't there a Pap smear for breast cancer? Because the Pap smear, the most successful screening test in all of medicine, took cervical cancer from 115,000 a year down to 10,000. We now have a vaccine to get it from 10,000 to zero. And its benefit was it gave you the look at the 10-year window of normal hyperplasia, atypical hyperplasia, and carcinoma in situ in the cervix. And we could do things, we could intervene. We don't have that in the breast. It now turns out that the mammographic breast density it is the Pap smear. And now we're in a process of trying to intervene with a 6-month treatment to lower the density, which we think will have a downstream effect of, in 2 to 3 to 4 years, being able to measure a decrease in the incidence of breast cancer in the world. During this conversation, you and I have had, Chris, one breast cancer a minute during this conversation. Um, Women are still the hubs in the social network of our lives. So when one woman gets breast cancer, the world feels that the 200 or 300 contacts in her network are impacted by that. So it's pretty catalytic to think about preventing breast cancer in the future.
That is something to be excited about for sure. All right. So you can reach Dr. Quay at www.drquay.com. I've got to share with you, I think I may have shared something when we first spoke, that I was always impressed with Dr. Linus Pauling because of his multifaceted career, where he actually had a PhD in biology and a PhD in chemistry, and biochemistry didn't exist. The course of this conversation is what I would imagine a conversation with Dr. Linus Pauling would have been like. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Chris, can I just say something about that? Well, so when I was teaching at Stanford, I got contacted by the Linus Pauling Institute because their scientists saw some of my work. And so I actually have a paper with the Linus Pauling Institute on the mechanism of how vitamin C gets changed chemically, because no one understood it at the time. And so it's one of my more often cited papers in the 390 is this paper with Linus Pauling's Institute there in Page Mill in Palo Alto, California. So I really appreciate that. It means a lot for you to make that analogy
very
with me.
cool. And that was the piece of his kind of last legacy, if you will, was like his intent focus on vitamin C. Again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris. Take care.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow. Also, make sure not to be that guy, the guy sharing this podcast with people who are not interested in living beyond the norms. If you would like to learn more about the ESS60 molecule, the molecule responsible for the single longest longevity experimental result on mammals in history, a full 90% extension of life, visit myvitalc.com. That's myvitalc as in carbon.com.